I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I never expected them to come after my car. That all changed when Veronica Davis, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, marched up my driveway as I was getting out of my truck. "Bradley Kent," she snapped, arms crossed so tight it looked like she was holding herself together out of pure spite. "Your truck is a menace to this community." I raised an eyebrow. A menace? The noise, every time you start that thing, it sounds like a jet engine taking off. It's unacceptable. Now, was my truck loud? Sure. It was a classic, a real beauty with a deep growl that any car guy would appreciate, but it wasn't some obnoxious, window-rattling monstrosity. And last I checked, there were no HOA rules about engine noise. "It's a legal vehicle, Veronica," I said, leaning on the door. "I'm not breaking any laws." She scoffed. "Well, it's disturbing the peace. I've had multiple complaints." "From who?" "That's not your concern," she snapped, her face turning red. "If you don't do something about it, I'll have to issue a formal violation." I sighed. "You do what you have to do, Veronica." I turned to walk inside. "This isn't over, Bradley," she called after me. I didn't think much of it. Veronica was always looking for something to complain about. She had tried to find my neighbor for having his garbage cans out 10 minutes too early, and once she even threatened a family down the street because their Christmas lights stayed up until January 3rd. But I should have known better. Veronica never let things go. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. "Noise violation. Your vehicle is in violation of community standards due to excessive noise levels. A fine of $200 has been issued. Further violations will result in additional fines and possible action against your property." I laughed. Unbelievable. There was no actual rule about this, and I knew it. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office. A bored-sounding receptionist picked up. "Yeah, I got a noise violation for my truck," I said. "There's no rule about that in the HOA guidelines." You'd have to speak with the board about that," she said. "Great, when's the next meeting?" "Next Thursday." "Perfect," I said, already planning how I was going to tear their fake complaint apart. But Veronica wasn't going to wait for a meeting. No, she had other plans. That night I was inside watching TV when I heard a weird scraping noise outside. I frowned, got up and looked out the window. My truck was parked in the driveway just where I always left it, but something felt off. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The second the beam hit my truck, my stomach clenched. There were deep scratches all along the side. Someone had keyed it, badly. My fists clenched. I knew exactly who would do something like this, but she had no idea what I had security cameras. I stormed back inside, pulled up the footage, and there it was, clear as day. Veronica Davis, sneaking up my driveway, looking around like some amateur criminal, and dragging her keys down the entire side of my truck. She thought she could get away with this. She thought wrong. The next morning, I drove straight to the police station. My truck looked like it had been through a war zone, the long, deep scratches stretching across both doors. I wasn't about to let Veronica get away with this. Inside the station, a desk sergeant looked up from his computer. He had the kind of face that had seen everything and wasn't impressed by any of it. I placed a USB drive on the counter. "I need to file a police report, vandalism, and I have proof." His eyes flicked to the drive. "Let's see it." I pulled out my phone and played the footage. He leaned in, watching as Veronica, in her ridiculous floral blouse and oversized sunglasses, crouched next to my truck and dragged her keys across the paint like she was signing a masterpiece. When the video ended, the sergeant let out a low whistle. "Well, that's about as clear as it gets. You know this woman." "Yeah," I said, "she's the HOA president." He gave me a look like that explained everything. "Figures, these HOA types think they own the law." He reached for some paperwork. "You want to press charges?" "Absolutely." He nodded. "We'll send someone over to talk to her. Might want to get an estimate for the damage, too." I had already planned on it. After leaving the station, I drove straight to a body shop, where the mechanic whistled through his teeth at the sight of the scratches. "That's gonna be pricey," he said. "You're looking at around $3,000, maybe more." I clenched my jaw. "Just give me the paperwork. I'll make sure the right person pays for it." By the time I got home, I was itching to see how Veronica would react when the cops showed up at her door. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, I heard voices outside. Stepping to my window, I saw two officers standing on Veronica's porch. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, her expression a mixture of outrage and disbelief. One of the officers gestured toward my house, clearly explaining the situation. Veronica shook her head, her mouth moving a mile a minute. She jabbed a finger toward them, then toward me, her face turning a deep shade of red. I stepped outside just in time to hear her voice rise. "This is ridiculous. That video could have been doctored." The officer, a tall guy with a no-nonsense stance, didn't even blink. "Ma'am, the footage is clear. You were caught in the act. If you have any evidence to dispute it, you're welcome to present it in court." Veronica turned, her eyes locking onto me like a heat-seeking missile. "You set me up." I folded my arms. "Are you seriously trying to claim that I forced you to key my truck?" Her nostrils flared. "This is harassment. You've been disturbing the entire neighborhood with that monstrosity, and now you're trying to ruin my reputation." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, we're not here to argue HOA policies. This is a case of property damage. We'll be filing charges and you'll need to appear in court." Veronica opened her mouth, then shut it again. She was realizing, probably for the first time in her power-hungry life, that she wasn't in control. I decided to twist the knife just a little. "Oh, and by the way, I got an estimate for repairs, $3,000. You'll be covering that." Her face went pale. "You can't be serious." The officer pulled out his notepad. "You can contest the amount in court, but given the surveillance footage, I'd suggest working something out before it comes to that." Veronica's fingers curled into fists, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned on her heel and slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. The officer turned back to me. "We'll be in touch with the case details. If she contacts you or tries to retaliate, let us know immediately." I nodded. "Oh, don't worry, I doubt she's done." And I was right. The very next day, a letter appeared in my mailbox. Not an official HOA notice, no, this was something different. A typed, unsigned letter on plain paper. "Due to continuous disturbances and multiple complaints, the HOA board has decided to take further action regarding your vehicle. Failure to comply with community standards will result in escalating penalties, including possible towing." I laughed out loud, the sheer audacity of it. She was trying to scare me, but she had no legal leg to stand on. Deciding it was time to put an end to this nonsense, I gathered my HOA's official rulebook, my security footage, and the police report, then headed to the next board meeting. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room filled with folding chairs. Residents were already seated, chatting in low voices. Veronica sat at the front, her expression smug until she saw me walk in. I took a seat near the front, placing my documents on the table. When the meeting officially started, I waited patiently through the usual nonsense budget updates, landscaping complaints until it was time for open concerns. I raised my hand. "I have an issue to discuss." Veronica's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is not the time for personal disputes, Bradley." I smiled. "Oh, I think it is. You see, I recently received a violation notice about my truck's noise level. However, there is no such rule in our HOA guidelines. I'd like to know why I was fined." Murmurs spread through the room. A few neighbors nodded, clearly interested. One of the board members, an older man with a skeptical look, glanced at Veronica. "Is this true? There's no rule about vehicle noise." Veronica straightened. "The board has the right to issue violations for disturbances that affect community harmony." I leaned forward. "Great. Then how do you explain the fact that, after I refused to pay, my truck was vandalized, and that I have clear security footage showing you doing it?" The room went silent. Veronica's face drained of color. I pulled out the printed stills from my security footage and held them up. "This is Veronica, on my property, keying my truck. I've already filed a police report, and she's been charged with vandalism." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Seriously." Veronica's hands trembled as she stood. "This is a personal attack. He's twisting the narrative." I turned to the board members. "And just yesterday, I received an anonymous letter, one that threatened to have my truck towed. This is harassment, plain and simple. I want an official review of Veronica's actions as HOA president." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a woman who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. "If these accusations are true, this is a serious violation of HOA ethics." Veronica sputtered, but before she could launch into another tirade, the skeptical board member spoke. "I move to hold an emergency vote on Veronica's removal from the HOA board." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Veronica paled. "You can't do this." But they could, and they did. The vote was unanimous. Within minutes, Veronica was officially removed from her position. As she stormed out of the room, I caught her eye and gave her a polite nod. She had tried to play dirty, but she'd forgotten one thing. When you break the law, you don't get to make the rules anymore. The fallout from Veronica's removal was immediate. Word spread fast through the neighborhood, and by the next morning people were talking. Some were relieved, some were shocked, and a few of her staunch supporters were scrambling to defend her, claiming it was all some kind of misunderstanding. But the facts were clear: she had vandalized my truck, the board had voted her out, and now she was facing charges. Her house, which had once been the epicenter of HOA control, was eerily quiet. No more clipboard inspections, no more early morning strolls where she'd glare at people's lawns like they had personally offended her. It was like the neighborhood had exhaled a collective breath. I figured that was the end of it. Veronica had lost, and she had no more power, but I had underestimated just how bitter she could be. The first sign of trouble came when I stepped outside to find my trash cans knocked over, garbage strewn across my driveway. At first, I thought maybe some raccoons had gone wild, but when I checked my security footage, there she was, Veronica, creeping around in the early hours, tipping my bins over like a petulant child. I shook my head. She was making this too easy. Instead of reacting, I simply sent the footage to the officer handling my case. If she wanted to keep digging herself into a deeper hole, I wasn't going to stop her. The next day, my mailbox was stuffed with HOA violation notices, all of them dated before she had been removed from the board. They accused me of everything from failure to maintain an aesthetically pleasing driveway to excessive use of outdoor lighting. Nice try. I walked them straight over to the new interim HOA president, Mr. Calloway, a retired lawyer who had always kept a low profile in neighborhood affairs until now. He glanced through the stack, let out a low chuckle, and shook his head. These are invalid. She had no authority to issue them after the board voted her out. Figured as much, I said, but I wanted to make sure she wasn't still pulling strings. He sighed, rubbing his temple. I knew she was strict, but I had no idea she was this vindictive. We'll send out an official notice invalidating all of these. If she keeps harassing you, let me know. I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. That night I was woken up by a loud hissing sound coming from outside. My stomach dropped. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and rushed out. One of my truck's tires was completely flat. Someone had slashed it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. There was no point in losing my temper, not when I had the one thing Veronica always seemed to forget existed. Cameras. I pulled up the footage, and there she was again, crouched near my truck with something in her hand. She slashed the tire, then scurried off like some kind of deranged raccoon. She wasn't just bitter, she was reckless. This time I wasn't going to wait. I called the police and sent them the footage. By the following afternoon, Veronica was in handcuffs on her front lawn, screaming about how the neighborhood was conspiring against her. People gathered to watch as she was led to the squad car, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some of her former supporters looked downright embarrassed. As she was placed in the backseat, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with pure venom. I simply crossed my arms and watched as the car pulled away. A few days later, I got a call from the officer handling her case. She's looking at multiple misdemeanor charges and some hefty fines. Between the vandalism, harassment, and property damage, she's in real trouble. Good, I said. Maybe she'll finally learn that she can't bully people and get away with it. But the real victory came a week later when Mr. Calloway called a special HOA meeting. Veronica's removal had left a gap in leadership, and the board wanted to make sure no one like her ever got that kind of unchecked power again. At the meeting, Mr. Calloway stood at the front of the room, addressing the gathered residents. We've seen the damage that an overzealous HOA president can do. Moving forward, we're implementing new bylaws to prevent one person from holding too much power. No more arbitrary fines, no more secret rule changes, and no more harassment of homeowners over personal vendettas. The room erupted into applause. Then he looked at me, and Bradley, if you're interested, we'd like to nominate you for a position on the board. I blinked. That was the last thing I expected. Amazing. You've dealt with this firsthand, he said, and you clearly care about fairness. We need people like that. I glanced at the people around me, my neighbors, the ones who had dealt with Veronica's nonsense for years. For the first time, they looked hopeful. I exhaled slowly, then nodded. All right, let's do this. Veronica had tried to make my life miserable, but in the end, all she had done was hand me the power to make sure no one like her ever ruled this neighborhood again. Stepping into the HOA board was like walking into a battlefield, only now, I wasn't fighting against them, I was part of the force that would reshape the neighborhood for the better. The first meeting after my appointment was tense. A few of Veronica's former allies sat stiffly, watching me like they expected me to start tearing up rulebooks the moment I sat down. Mr. Calloway, now officially the HOA president, called the meeting to order. The agenda was loaded with long overdue issues, most of them problems that had been swept under the rug during Veronica's reign. Residents had complaints about arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and general distrust in the board's decision-making. The first major point of discussion, undoing the nonsense rules Veronica had put in place. A woman named Diane, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years, leaned forward, frustration clear on her face. She said that her son had been fined multiple times for parking his car on the street overnight, despite other residents doing the same without issue. She wanted to know if she was going to get her money back, or if the board was going to keep pretending like it never happened. Calloway assured her that all questionable fines issued under Veronica's leadership were under review, and that any found to be unfair would be refunded. That wasn't enough for some other residents. A man named Greg, a retired firefighter, wanted to know how the board planned to make sure this kind of abuse wouldn't happen again. He wasn't interested in just getting his money back, he wanted permanent changes that would prevent another power-hungry board member from running the HOA like a dictatorship. That was my moment. I laid out a proposal, new bylaws that required major HOA decisions like fines and property rule changes to be voted on by the entire board rather than being dictated by a single person. If an HOA president wanted to issue a fine, they would need approval from at least 2 other board members. Additionally, all board meetings would be recorded and made available to residents. One of Veronica's old allies, a man named Curtis, immediately opposed the idea. He claimed that adding more steps would slow down decision-making and make it harder to enforce rules. But the residents weren't buying it. They had lived under Veronica's rule long enough to know that efficient enforcement was just another way of saying unchecked power. After a heated debate, the board took a vote. The reforms passed by an overwhelming majority. The atmosphere shifted. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't just some faceless entity issuing fines from the shadows. People actually felt heard. But not everyone was ready to move on, least of all Veronica. Despite her arrest and removal from the board, she still owned her home, and that meant she wasn't going anywhere. She kept to herself for the most part, but every so often, I'd catch her glaring at me from her porch. I knew she was waiting for an opportunity to strike back. Her first attempt was petty. She hired a lawyer to try and sue me for defamation, claiming that my security footage had been manipulated to frame her. Her case didn't make it past the first hearing. The footage was crystal clear. The police had already charged her, and the judge dismissed her claims before they could even gain traction. Her next move was more desperate. Late one night, my doorbell rang. When I checked the camera feed, I saw Veronica standing there, arms crossed, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen her. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Her voice was sharp, but there was an edge of anxiety beneath it. She said she had something to discuss that would benefit both of us. I didn't say anything, just waited. She hesitated, then admitted that she was in trouble. The legal fees, the fines, the loss of her position in the HOA, it had all piled up faster than she could handle. She was facing financial ruin and wanted me to drop the charges. I asked her why I would ever consider that after everything she had done. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. She told me that she had information things about the HOA's finances, about shady deals that had been made under the table while she was in charge. If I helped her get out of her legal mess, she would hand over proof that could bring down more than just her. I wasn't interested in making deals, but I was very interested in what she had to say. I told her I wasn't dropping any charges, but if she had real evidence of corruption, she could bring it to the board and the police. That was her only option. She scoffed, saying I was naive if I thought the HOA board wasn't still covering things up. I told her that was exactly why I was on the board now, to clean up the mess she and her cronies had left behind. She left without another word, but I knew she wouldn't stop scheming. The next morning, I called Mr. Calloway and told him about Veronica's late-night visit. He wasn't surprised. He said he had suspected for a while that Veronica hadn't been acting alone. She had been too confident, too bold, someone else had been backing her. We decided to launch an internal audit of the HOA's finances. What we found was worse than I expected. There were records of unexplained expenses, large sums of money that had been moved around with no clear purpose. some of those violations that Veronica had issued over the years. The fines had been deposited into accounts that weren't officially tied to the HOA. Veronica had been running a racket, collecting fines and funneling the money into a personal slush fund. The board gathered all the evidence and turned it over to the police. Within a week, an official investigation was launched. When the news broke, the neighborhood erupted. People who had been afraid to speak out before suddenly started coming forward with their own stories: unjust fines, bizarre HOA charges, intimidation tactics. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was a pattern of corruption that had been going on for years. Veronica's home was raided by investigators. They seized documents, computers, anything that might contain more evidence of financial misconduct. Her final attempt at retaliation came in the form of one last desperate letter, an anonymous note in my mailbox, warning me that I had made powerful enemies. I laughed when I read it. Veronica had lost everything. She had no power left, no influence, no allies. She was just trying to scare me because it was the only weapon she had left. A month later, Veronica was officially charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and vandalism. The HOA board, now fully restructured, implemented new transparency policies, ensuring that no one would ever be able to abuse their position the way she had. The neighborhood was finally free of her reign, and my truck, still parked in my driveway, running as loud and proud as ever. With Veronica facing charges and the HOA under new leadership, the neighborhood finally felt like it was headed in the right direction. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before were coming forward with their own experiences, sharing horror stories of the outrageous fines and intimidation tactics they had endured under her control. But there was still unfinished business. The audit had revealed that Veronica wasn't the only one involved in the embezzlement scheme. Someone else had been helping her, moving money around to keep things hidden. The question was, who? The board held a special closed session to discuss the findings. Mr. Calloway set a thick folder on the table, filled with records of suspicious transactions. The numbers didn't lie. Someone had been siphoning HOA funds for years. Curtis, one of Veronica's former allies, sat stiffly across from me, his fingers tapping against the table. He had been vocal in defending her before, and now he looked extremely uncomfortable. Mr. Calloway didn't waste time. He flipped open the folder and pointed to a series of transactions from previous years. The amounts were large, but they had been disguised as community improvement expenses. The problem was, none of those improvements had ever happened. Curtis shifted in his seat and asked what exactly they were suggesting. Mr. Calloway stated plainly that someone had been helping Veronica move money out of HOA accounts, and he wanted answers. Curtis scoffed and said that if they had actual proof of wrongdoing, they should just come out and say it. I leaned forward and pointed out that the financial records showed his signature on several of the largest transactions. His face tightened, and for the first time he stopped tapping his fingers. The other board members exchanged glances. The evidence was damning, but Curtis wasn't going to go down without a fight. He leaned back and said that just because his signature was on something didn't mean he had been involved in any crimes. He claimed that Veronica had handled most of the financial decisions herself, and that he had signed things without looking too closely. Mr. Calloway wasn't buying it. He noted that these weren't minor expenses, they were large sums of money, and it was hard to believe anyone would sign off on them without asking questions. Curtis exhaled sharply and said that if they were going to accuse him of something, they better have more than just a few signatures. I pointed out that he had been one of Veronica's closest supporters, and that the financial records showed that the money was moved in a way that required multiple approvals. Someone else had to have been helping her, and he was the only other board member with access to those funds. Curtis glanced around the room, realizing that the rest of the board wasn't on his side. He tried to argue that Veronica had manipulated him, that she had been the real mastermind, and that he had just been following her lead. Mr. Calloway said that whether or not Veronica had been the leader didn't change the fact that Curtis had played a role. The board took a vote on whether to report Curtis to the authorities. It was unanimous. As soon as the decision was made, Curtis stood abruptly and said that this was a witch hunt. I told him that if he had nothing to hide, he wouldn't be so defensive. He turned to Mr. Calloway and said that he had been a loyal member of the HOA for years, and that throwing him under the bus like this was a mistake. Mr. Calloway replied that the only mistake was thinking he could get away with it. Curtis stormed out of the room, but it was too late. The board had already made its decision, and the evidence was being turned over to the police. The fallout was immediate. Curtis resigned from the board the next morning, but that didn't stop the investigation. Within a week, he was officially charged with financial fraud. The neighborhood was shaken. People who had once trusted the HOA blindly were now questioning everything. Mr. Calloway held a public meeting to reassure residents that the corruption was being rooted out and that the board was committed to rebuilding trust. During the meeting, residents voiced concerns about whether other board members had been involved. Mr. Calloway assured them that the audit had only implicated Veronica and Curtis. A resident asked how they could be sure that the new board wouldn't become just as corrupt. I answered that the new bylaws ensured no single person could make financial decisions without full transparency. Another resident stood and said that for the first time in years, they actually felt like the HOA was listening. The mood in the room shifted. People weren't just angry anymore, they were hopeful. Veronica and Curtis had spent years turning the HOA into their own personal kingdom, but now the neighborhood was taking back control. A few days later, as I pulled into my driveway, my neighbor Greg waved me over. He said that he had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had never seen an HOA president get arrested before. I laughed and said that there was a first time for everything. Greg said that the neighborhood owed me one. I told him that I didn't do it alone. He nodded and said that either way, it was about time someone stood up to them. As I walked back to my house, I realized that for the first time since moving in, I actually felt at peace. The HOA had gone from being a nightmare to something that might actually serve the community instead of controlling it. And as for Veronica, she was facing serious legal trouble, and with Curtis also under investigation, it was unlikely that either of them would be able to weasel their way out of this. The neighborhood was finally free. With Veronica and Curtis out of the picture, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The HOA had been a weapon for years, used to control and intimidate people rather than serve them. Now, with the worst offenders gone, we had a real opportunity to fix things for good. Mr. Calloway wasted no time in pushing reforms. The board meetings were no longer secretive gatherings where a few people made all the decisions. Instead, they were open forums where anyone could speak their mind. Residents were encouraged to bring up concerns, and for the first time, people actually felt like they had a say in what happened in their own neighborhood. It wasn't just about undoing the damage Veronica had done. It was about making sure no one else could ever pull the same stunts again. One of the biggest changes was the way fines were handled. Under Veronica, people would wake up to notices on their doors, demanding hundreds of dollars for the pettiest infractions. Now, every fine had to be approved by the entire board, with clear documentation explaining why it was issued. No more secret penalties, no more arbitrary punishments. Greg, the retired firefighter, proposed that we start using some of the HOA funds for actual community improvements, things that benefited everyone, not just the board's personal projects. The idea was met with overwhelming support. Instead of wasting money on nonsense, we could finally invest in things that mattered. For the first time in years, the HOA was actually working for the people. But of course, not everyone was happy about the change. While most of the neighborhood was relieved to be free from Veronica's reign, there were still a few holdouts who had benefited from the old system. A small group of homeowners, mostly the ones who had cozied up to Veronica over the years, started murmuring about how the new board was too soft. One evening, as I was locking up my garage, a familiar voice called out from across the street. Curtis's wife, Marlene, stood on the sidewalk, arms folded. She had always been one of Veronica's biggest supporters, and even now, with her husband facing charges, she still acted like she was untouchable. She claimed that the neighborhood was falling apart without Veronica's leadership. The rules were getting too relaxed, and soon, the place would be overrun with unkempt lawns, loud parties, and people parking wherever they wanted. I told her that the only thing falling apart was the corrupt system that had let her husband and Veronica get away with robbing the community for years. She scoffed and said that people like me didn't understand what it took to maintain order. I told her that what she called order was just a way to control people. The community wasn't falling apart, it was finally being given a chance to thrive. Marlene shook her head and muttered that she wasn't going to sit back and watch everything her friends had built get ruined. I wasn't worried about her. She could complain all she wanted, but the reality was that she had no power left. Still, I kept an eye out. People like her didn't just fade into the background, they found new ways to stir up trouble. A week later, I got a call from Mr. Calloway. Someone had filed a formal complaint against me with the HOA, claiming that my truck was still an ongoing disturbance, and demanding that action be taken. I wasn't surprised. The complaint was anonymous, but it was obvious who was behind it. The board reviewed it, and within minutes it was dismissed. There were no rules against my truck, and everyone knew it. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, I found a bright orange sticker on my windshield. It was a fake towing notice, warning that my vehicle was in violation of community noise ordinances and would be removed if I didn't comply. I peeled it off and checked my cameras. Sure enough, there was Marlene, sneaking onto my driveway in the middle of the night, slapping the sticker onto my truck with a smug grin. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Instead of confronting her, I forwarded the footage to the board. At the next meeting, Mr. Calloway brought it up in front of everyone. Marlene sat near the back, arms crossed, listening as he explained that someone had been caught trespassing on private property and attempting to intimidate a homeowner with fraudulent notices. Then he pulled up the footage on the projector. The room went silent as everyone watched Marlene, clear as day, walking onto my property and placing the sticker on my windshield. She tried to defend herself, claiming that she was just making a point about how the neighborhood was changing for the worse. Mr. Calloway shut that down immediately. He explained that trespassing and false notices were serious violations, and if she pulled another stunt like that, legal action would be taken. Marlene turned red and stormed out, but she didn't try anything else after that. With her out of the way, things finally started to settle. The changes we had made to the HOA were taking effect, and for the first time in a long time, people actually felt like they had control over their own homes. There were no more ridiculous fines, no more secret rules, and no more power-hungry board members treating the neighborhood like their personal kingdom. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And as for my truck, it was still parked in my driveway, loud and proud. No one dared to complain about it anymore.